People think gold is about metal. It is not. Gold is about permission. It is about who can touch it, who can freeze it, who can delay it, who can redefine the rules around it, and who can smile at you while telling you that your asset is still yours, even though your access to it now depends on their politics. That is why I paid very close attention when France sold 129 tons of gold that had been sitting in New York, replaced that gold with equivalent reserves bought in Europe, and walked away with roughly 12.8 billion euros in gains. Most people looked at that and saw a clever trade. I looked at it and saw something bigger. I saw great power buying back control over its own monetary lifeboat and getting paid to do it between July 2025 and January 2026. The Bank of France unwound the last meaningful residue of a century-old arrangement. Over 7 months, in the 26th of September Air 8 transactions, it sold older bars in the American market, bought equivalent compliant bars in Europe and placed them in Paris. That one decision turned a 2024 net loss of 7.7 billion euros into a 2025 net profit of 8.1 billion euros. But the accounting victory was not the real prize. The real prize was that for the first time in about 100 years, France ended up with zero gold in the United States. Read that again in the right frame: zero. A country with roughly 2,437 tons of reserves, worth more than $200 billion, decided that the final convenience of keeping any of its national gold under American custody was no longer worth the hidden risk. And when a nation does that quietly, politely, and profitably, you should not dismiss it as a technical tidying up exercise. You should ask the adult question, what changed in the mind of the owner? Because markets do not break first in public language. They break first in private trust. The official explanation was neat. Some of the bars in New York did not meet modern standards for liquidity and trading. Shipping those same bars home, refining them, and requalifying them would have been costly and cumbersome. So France sold the old bars where they sat, bought newer bars where the right market already existed, and stored those bars in Paris. That explanation is technically plausible. It is also strategically revealing. In my world, whenever somebody gives you a technical explanation for a sovereign behavior shift, you should pay attention to the noun they are trying to keep you from examining. Here the hidden noun is jurisdiction. France did not simply improve the format of its gold. France improved the legal geography of its gold, and that is a very different sentence. The mother line of this whole story is simple. The asset is not the asset, control of the asset is the asset. The price is not the prize. Access is the prize. And if you remember that one line, you will understand not only what France did, but why the next decade will be defined less by flashy headlines about inflation and more by a quieter struggle over custody, convertibility, and sovereign control. I want to walk you through the machinery of it, because this is where people lose the plot. The first mechanism is what I call the sovereignty spread. Most people think a gain comes from taking more risk. That is not always true. Sometimes the largest gain comes from moving the same wealth into a safer form while everyone else is still pricing it like a neutral asset. France sold 129 tons and bought back 129 tons. The weight did not change. Gold remained gold, but the location changed, the bar standard changed, the legal reach changed, and the optionality changed. That is where the spread lived. On paper, the gain came from selling an asset at 2025 and 2026 market prices that had been carried on the books at much older values. In practical terms, France monetized an old inventory position into a new reserve configuration at exactly the moment gold prices were rising because central banks were buying, inflation hedges were back in fashion, and geopolitical stress was climbing. So yes, the accounting gain was real, but the deeper gain was this. France converted passive exposure into sovereign control without losing reserve weight. That is not a trade. That is a state-level upgrade. When I invest, I am always asking whether I am being paid merely to own something or being paid to improve the quality of my position. France improved the quality of its position, it improved its custody, it improved its access, it improved its legal clarity, it improved its emergency optionality, and it got billions in profit as a side effect. That is the sovereignty spread. The market says you just changed format. Reality says you changed your freedom. And once you learn to look for this spread, you start seeing it everywhere. A family keeps 6 months of savings at a bank they cannot reach during a regional shutdown. A business keeps all of its receivables tied to one payment rail it does not control. An investor thinks he owns an asset because he sees a number on a screen, but in truth, he owns only a claim nested inside another institution. As promise. On good days, these all feel identical. On bad days, the spread appears. That is when ownership and access stop being synonyms. That is when people discover that the most expensive part of any asset was the layer they never priced. The second mechanism is what I call the courtesy fiction. Big institutions almost never announce a loss of trust by using the language of lost trust. They use the language of maintenance. They say modernization. They say efficiency. They say liquidity alignment. They say technical standards. And sometimes those things are true. But when the owner is a sovereign state, the technical story often serves as diplomatic packaging for a political conclusion that nobody wants to shout into the microphone. France's central bank said the decision was not politically motivated because higher standard gold trades in European markets. Fine. But ask the next question. Why do those markets matter so much now? Because gold that sits under your own legal system is not merely easier to trade. It is easier to trust. The European gold market did not become strategically important by accident. It became strategically important because European institutions increasingly value reserves that can be mobilized, audited, refined, traded, and defended inside their own jurisdiction. That is not a refinery story. That is a sovereignty story wearing a necktie. And I have seen this pattern my entire life. Whenever people are ashamed to admit fear, they rename fear as prudence. Whenever institutions do not want to trigger alarm, they translate strategy into procedure. The words get softer exactly when the move gets harder. That is why you should never listen only to the explanation. You should study the sacrifice. What did France sacrifice? Convenience. For decades, storing gold in New York came with prestige, liquidity, tradition, and easy access to a powerful market. France surrendered that convenience. What did France gain? Control. That tells you what really mattered. Human beings reveal their hierarchy of values not through speeches, but through the conveniences they are willing to give up. Once a country gives up convenience for control, the polite explanation no longer matters very much. The truth is already in the trade. The third mechanism is what I call rule change memory. This is where the story becomes much bigger than France. Every financial system runs on explicit rules and implicit beliefs. The explicit rules are printed, the implicit beliefs are borrowed from history. And when history changes, the implicit beliefs reprice faster than any official statement can keep up with. France has old memories in this area. Charles de Gaulle understood in the 1960s that monetary sovereignty is not a philosophical luxury. It is a practical matter of possession. Between 1963 and 1966, France moved most of its gold away from foreign custody and challenged dollar dominance by demanding gold in exchange for dollar reserves. The point is not theatrical nationalism. The point was simple. A reserve you cannot physically command is not a full reserve. That older French instinct never disappeared. It merely left a small residue behind. For decades, France kept roughly 5% of its gold in New York. That may have looked harmless. Maybe it was diplomatic. Maybe the old bars were not worth the transport and refining cost. Maybe nobody felt urgency. Then history supplied urgency. In 1933, the American government changed the rules around gold at home. In 1971, the American government ended dollar convertibility into gold for foreign central banks. And in 2022, after Russia invaded Ukraine, Western authorities froze more than $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves. Do not get distracted here by whether you liked that decision, hated that decision, or considered it morally justified. That is not the key analytical question. The key question is what every other central bank learned from the precedent. They learned that reserves held inside the architecture of a foreign power are not just assets. They are conditional assets, conditional on politics, conditional on alignment, conditional on crisis, conditional on the other side not deciding that the emergency is large enough to alter what yesterday looked permanent. Once that lesson enters the bloodstream, trust changes form. The old assumption was that New York was a neutral vault attached to the world's deepest capital markets. The new assumption is that New York may still be useful, but it is no longer neutral in the old unquestioned sense. And that shift matters because reserve management is not built on slogans. It is built on worst-case imagination. The moment a serious institution begins to imagine a scenario in which access could be slowed, contested, conditioned, or frozen, the arithmetic changes, that is, rule change memory. It means past exceptions become present inputs. It means every historic breach of neutrality raises the future value of self-custody. It means that after enough precedent, the rational actor stops asking whether a freeze is likely and starts asking whether the cost of prevention is now low enough to justify moving first. France answered yes. And when one large, sophisticated state answers yes without suffering a visible penalty, the answer begins to travel. The fourth mechanism is what I call the custodian flip. This is the point where a trusted helper becomes a strategic variable. For a very long time, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York functioned as a kind of supreme custodian in the minds of foreign reserve managers. It offered convenience, liquidity, status, and a legal environment backed by American power. Those qualities made New York more than a storage location. They made it part of the operating system of global finance. But every operating system has one non-negotiable requirement. The user must believe the system will execute the same command tomorrow that it executed yesterday. Once that belief weakens, the platform does not collapse overnight. It begins to lose sacredness, and that is exactly what France's move signals. Not panic, not rupture. Something more damaging. Desanctification. The vault remains standing. The bars are still there, the market still functions. But the aura of unquestioned neutrality begins to erode. That is when a custodian stops being treated as an invisible utility and starts being evaluated as a potential counterparty. That is a huge identity flip. A custodian is supposed to disappear into the background. A counterparty is somebody whose incentives you must model. Once New York becomes something you have to model politically rather than merely use operationally, the entire reserve logic changes. Now it is not just France. Germany still has gold worth roughly $142 billion. Much of it in New York and London. A German economist in early 2026 openly warned that the current geopolitical climate made storing so much gold in the United States look risky. That kind of language matters. Not because one economist speaks for a whole state, but because elites often say in analytical form what institutions are not ready to say in official form. And if Germany moves even partially, the symbolism will dwarf the French case simply because the numbers are so large. Then everyone starts doing the same mental math. If Berlin can reduce American custody exposure, why not Rome? If Rome can do it, why not Madrid? If America's treaty allies are de-risking legal exposure to U.S. jurisdiction, what are emerging market central banks supposed to conclude? This is how reputation changes, not in one dramatic announcement, in a sequence of rational imitations. That is what the world misses when it laughs off a technical gold upgrade. The bars are the surface. The template is the story. The fifth mechanism is what I call the no-consequence template. This is the most dangerous mechanism in finance because it scales through imitation. France just demonstrated something that every reserve manager in the world could understand in one sentence. You can bring your gold home, book an enormous gain, increase strategic independence, and suffer no immediate punishment. That is a template. And templates travel faster than arguments. If France had pulled its gold home and been hammered diplomatically, shamed publicly, shut out of markets, or forced into some visible concession, then other governments would at least have to price a retaliation variable. But that did not happen. Instead, France got paid, it reduced jurisdiction risk, it strengthened domestic control. It deepened the strategic importance of European gold markets, and it showed other nations that the act of repatriation can be presented as routine balance sheet housekeeping while actually carrying long-term geopolitical force. That matters because central bankers are not romantic revolutionaries. They are often cautious bureaucrats. They move when the path is technically defensible, politically survivable, and institutionally copyable. France supplied all three. This is why I believe the event is not isolated, it is instructional. Once one country shows that sovereignty can be improved quietly, profitably, and without obvious blowback, the barrier to imitation falls sharply. That is when the second mover problem disappears. And once the second mover problem disappears, the pattern gains momentum. Germany does not have to say it distrusts America. It can say it is rebalancing reserves. Italy does not have to say it fears financial coercion. It can say it is modernizing custody. The Netherlands does not have to say the world has changed. It can say it is aligning reserve management with operational efficiency. Each individual statement sounds mild. The aggregate behavior screams the truth. Sovereigns are de-risking America. If that sentence sounds too strong for polite television, good. That is why it matters. Truth almost always sounds impolite in the phase before it becomes obvious. Now I want to turn the lens because the real value of a story like this is not only in predicting what states will do next, it is in understanding the operating system beneath the move. I have spent my life trying to separate what people own from what they merely rent emotionally. And one of the great errors investors make is to confuse market value with command value. They see price and assume control. They see ownership statements and assume access. They see regulations and assume permanence. But in every serious crisis, command value outruns market value. Who controls the gates matters more than who framed the contract. That is true for nations, and it is true for households. So let me give you the blueprint I would use to read not only France's decision, but almost any financial arrangement that appears safe until stress arrives. I begin with the control test. Who can say yes without asking permission from an external political actor? France now holds all of its gold inside French territory under French legal jurisdiction. That means in a true emergency, the line between decision and action is much shorter. That shortening has value. Then I use the conversion test. Can the asset be mobilized, sold, pledged, refined, exchanged, or restructured where you actually live inside the legal environment you trust? That was part of the logic of buying compliant bars in Europe rather than hauling old bars home one by one for costly processing. Then I used the freeze test. What event would have to happen before somebody else could interrupt access after the Russian reserve freeze? You do not need a vivid imagination to understand why this question now sits higher on every central bank's desk. Then I use the humiliation test. If a crisis hit tomorrow, would the owner be forced to negotiate publicly for permission to reach what is supposed to already belong to him? That is a brutal test, but it cuts through fantasy very fast. And then I use the inheritance test. If this arrangement continues for another decade, does it make the next decision easier or harder for the owner? France just made the next French decision easier. More gold at home means more domestic familiarity, more domestic infrastructure, more domestic legal habit, and more strategic continuity. That is how systems harden. One good move lowers the cost of the next good move. One bad dependence raises the price of escape. That is why I do not think the signal ends with gold. Gold is just the cleanest visible symbol. The deeper question is whether reserve holders will increasingly prefer assets and settlement structures less exposed to American legal reach. If you do not trust custody, you eventually revisit reserves. If you revisit reserves, you eventually revisit settlement. If you revisit settlement, you eventually revisit the hierarchy of the global system itself. That is how empires weaken in finance. Not because they run out of speeches, because other actors begin redesigning daily habits around reduced dependency. And the tragedy for the old center is that it usually does not lose power all at once. it loses the reflex of being chosen by default. That is the real danger signal here. Not that America loses every advantage tomorrow, but that New York is no longer accepted with the same sacred automaticity it once enjoyed. Once automaticity breaks, negotiation begins. Once negotiation begins, premiums move. Once premiums move, capital follows, and once capital follows. The map changes long before the headlines admit it. There is another layer to this that I do not want you to miss. France did not merely protect itself, it turned protection into profit. That is a powerful psychological event. People learn slowly from morality, they learn quickly from incentives. Show them a sermon and they nod. Show them a profitable precedent and they copy. That is why this episode will echo. It is one thing to tell central banks they should consider sovereign custody. It is another thing to show them that a country can remove the last 129 tons from New York, lock in roughly 12.8 billion euros, eliminate residual U.S. custody exposure, and emerge looking prudent rather than radical. That changes the social status of the move. Now, repatriation is no longer the hobby horse of suspicious nationalists or monetary romantics. Now it can be presented as competent reserve management. That is the moment an idea becomes scalable. I can already hear the objection, Warren. This is just one country. This is just gold. This does not mean the dollar system is ending tomorrow. Of course not. Serious shifts rarely arrive as cartoon endings. The dollar does not need to disappear for its aura to thin. American markets do not need to fail for American custody to be repriced. U.S. Treasuries do not need to be abandoned for legal diversification to gather momentum. Systems can remain dominant and still become less trusted at the margin. And those margins matter because marginal decisions set future direction. A single household reducing credit card debt does not change the national economy. 1 million households doing it changes retail, lending, and housing. One country repatriating gold is an anecdote. Several major countries quietly reducing legal exposure to U.S. custody becomes a regime shift. That is why I pay attention to the behavior before the doctrine. Behavior writes the future first. Doctrine arrives later to explain what already happened. You saw the same thing when sanctions made reserve freezes thinkable at scale. You saw the same thing when countries began diversifying reserve purchases toward gold more aggressively. You are seeing it again now in the way Europe is slowly building the habit of controlling more of its own strategic financial plumbing. This is not about emotional anti-Americanism. It is about grown-up risk management. When a state concludes that another state's legal environment may become a variable rather than a neutral container, it starts buying down that risk. France just bought it down. That is why the final profit figure, as large as it is, may actually distract people from the larger number. The larger number is 100 years. That is roughly how long France tolerated at least some gold sitting in the United States. A pattern that old does not get completed by accident. When a century-long residue is finally removed, that is not housekeeping. That is closure. And closure is what sophisticated actors pursue when they think the next decade will be rougher than the last one. France is still upgrading older bars and coins already in Paris with plans stretching out toward 2028. That matters too, because it tells you this is not a one-afternoon gesture. It is a staged reserve modernization anchored in a strategic direction. Get the bars home, get the standards right, get the legal control clean, get the optionality back. That is an operating system. And the countries watching this are not only watching the headline, they are watching the process. They are watching how quietly it can be done. They are watching how the public can be told it is technical. They are watching how the ledger can be improved while the speech remains calm. That is exactly how professionals copy one another. Not with slogans, with procedures. So what should an intelligent person take away from all of this? Not hysteria, not gold worship, not fantasy. Take away this. In every layer of finance, from the scale of a household all the way to the scale of a state, the most dangerous illusion is the illusion that recorded ownership equals immediate command. Sometimes it does, sometimes it does not. And the entire difference between safety and fragility lives in that gap. If your savings, your collateral, your income channels, your settlement rails, or your emergency reserves all sit behind gates controlled by somebody whose incentives can change faster than your assumptions, then you do not have a portfolio. You have a permission structure. And permission structures are wonderful until they are revised. That is why I have always preferred arrangements where the line between my asset and my decision is short. Short lines reduce dependence. Short lines reduce bargaining under duress. Short lines reduce the number of people who can surprise you when the weather turns ugly. France just shortened its line. America, whether it likes it or not, has now been told something very clearly by an ally. We prefer our lifeboat at home. And once an ally says that with action rather than opinion, trust has already moved, this is where the story becomes a mirror, because every era gives people one final chance to admit what system they are really living inside. An era of unquestioned American financial stewardship trained the world to believe that convenience and neutrality could live together forever. Maybe for a long time they did. But once the rules around reserves become visibly political, neutral storage stops being a permanent assumption and becomes a temporary favor. That changes everything. It changes how countries store wealth. It changes how institutions think about sanctions. It changes how central banks rank gold versus paper promises. It changes what younger powers learn from older ones. And it changes the quiet hierarchy of trust underneath the visible hierarchy of prices. So here is the final choice as I see it. You can keep telling yourself that custody is a footnote and ownership is enough. Or you can grow up and admit that in money, as in life, the person who controls access controls the truth. You can live by statement balances and ceremonial assumptions, or you can build around command jurisdiction and the right to act without begging. You can wait until a crisis teaches you the price of distance, or you can shorten the distance before the crisis arrives. France made its choice. It chose sovereignty over convenience. It chose control over ceremony. It chose a domestic vault over a prestigious foreign promise, and it did not make that choice as a protest gesture. It made that choice because history taught it what too many people only learn when it is already expensive. The rules are stable until they are not. The custodian is neutral until he is not. The permission is automatic until it is not. That is the whole game. And when you finally understand that, you stop asking where the gold is. You start asking who would have to say yes if you needed it tomorrow. That question separates wealth from theater. It separates reserves from decorations. It separates ownership from dependence. And in the years ahead, I believe more nations will be forced to answer it. Some will answer early and quietly. Some will answer late and defensively. Some will pretend the old world is still intact until the imitation pattern is too large to deny. But the threshold has been crossed. France proved that the gold can go home. France proved that the owner can get richer in the act of becoming harder to pressure. France proved that sovereign adults no longer have to confuse American custody with financial destiny. That is why this is not a gold story. It is a trust story. It is a control story. It is a jurisdiction story. And above all, it is a warning when even allies begin bringing the lifeboats back inside their own walls. The age of blind trust is already over. The only question left is who will admit it early enough to act before the crowd turns that admission into consensus.